I'm Rachel. I come from the west of England, but have lived in London for 8 years. Belmonte feels quite close to me in that it has parallels with my hometown, which is in a rural area in which many of the young people, like myself, left as soon as they finished school. The nearest town was 4 miles from my house, and the public transport wasn't great, so we walked most places before we could drive. This town was known as the heart of the Five Valleys. Similar to the landscape here, it was characterised by steep hills and valleys with streams that fed watermills. In the past, the people of these valleys were renowned as being excellent storytellers, but were often unable to read or write well. With this largely oral history, similar to Belmonte, many of the dialects, traditions, and older ways of living in this landscape are now moving out of first-hand memory. So when I first came to Belmonte in 2016 for a university field trip, I was particularly interested in the traditions of the town and how these served as a vehicle for passing on memories from one year to the next, creating a stable link between generations, something that remains constant whilst times change. I returned to Belmonte last autumn as an academic mentor and to write 2 papers for an MA in architecture. The 2 papers were linked in theme, that is, ways of approaching place-based change and regeneration, but from slightly different angles. Belmonte and the cultural activities of Seppie in the area were interesting for these studies as they demonstrate community-led and very creative ways of reactivating areas over longer periods of time, which serves as a critique to how development has historically occurred in cities such as London, where local voices become lost, change is rapid and destructive, and complex and organically formed spatial environments supporting equally intricate social networks are destroyed, and the resulting development serves the interests of only private investors and high earners. The second thesis considered regeneration less in a spatial, architectural sense, but more in terms of the way communities navigate time and how history is brought forward through traditions, thought structures, and memory. It began as an inquiry into how gender roles connected to different ways of passing on information and of communicating, and it was also a study informed by the studies of a fellow resident who was writing about the Belmonte tomato and why some farmers here were reluctant to share their tomato seeds and farming methods. In this way, the title No Man's Land had the double meaning of talking about complex or inverted matriarchal society structures, maybe matriarchies imposed by patriarchies, but also about concepts of belonging, ownership, and mediums of communication, a no man's land being a zone between one side and another. Language and writing as a medium of communication is always interesting because it's a good example of the way modern cultures are ghosted by past ones, in that a language is useful in its everyday sense, but also useful as a tool to understand concepts and beliefs, which can be found in its origins and structure. Something we have thought about a lot in the projects in Belmonte is what is shared, what is common, and language is also one of these common lands. Nobody owns a language and it constantly changes. But also, the language we think in is a structure that to some extent governs the structure of our thoughts. So connected to this and the ideas of ownership and communication, another important concept in the thesis was the double and linked meanings of the word preoccupation. In its first sense, what has come before, and in its second sense, the idea of something possessing your thoughts. Preoccupation was also a name given to the sense of worry, fear, and anxiety, particularly historically in this region in the south of Italy due to the insecurity of not owning one's home or the land one was working on, and the threat of poverty through bad harvests due to destructive weather or an unfair landlord. Belmonte has been a unique place to consider how community structures and roles of traditions and superstitions operate in this uncertain environment, maintaining a sense of stability, which is relevant now when acknowledging our fragility in increasingly uncertain times. But defensiveness isn't always positive, and the tomato seed was an example of a highly defended piece of information, where its close protection was potentially denying its chance to grow. The time in Belmonte was a time to question where we draw boundaries concerning ownership, considering that even the contents of one's personal preoccupations, ideas, and memories are crowdsourced from those that came before us, and the influences we are open to. As much as we might like to think of ourselves as individual units, maybe there is no part of us, physically or mentally, that did not once come from something or somebody else. So the study ended up being more about the idea of regenerative practices as ones of metabolism, analysing how the information our past and our external influences give us is processed, and then how we choose to preserve, transform and communicate it on a bodily scale but also on a community scale. The thesis was informed and facilitated by residents of the area and those from other areas in the south of Italy across several generations who demonstrated how feelings of warmth and pride in their roots can be combined effectively with a sharp critique, demonstrating that a secure connection to one's heritage does not necessarily mean to become fixed or defensive of a past and averse to new influences, which is perhaps particularly relevant to Belmonte today when it considers its future in relation to its history and its potential as a global centre.